Welcome to all of you at Madras and at Northgate, and those of you who are joining online. I'm glad you took time to join in with this today. And today I want to talk to you about purity. In our society we have certain rules and standards of purity. I have friends who won't go to any restaurant until they know the health rating, the cleanliness, the purity of the restaurant. And I find that while lots of people know about those kind of ratings, they don't know that our food also has the similar kind of rating associated with it, standards of purity. In fact, our whole government has a branch of the government that's dedicated to keeping our food at a certain purity level. It's called the Food and Drug Administration, and they have standards for purity with regard to our food. But to be honest, their standards are pretty weird when you first hear them. In fact, let me just share with you some of the standards of purity that come from the FDA. The first one I'll give you has to do with apple butter. I know lots of people love apple butter, particularly for breakfast on toast or, on a biscuit. Here's the purity standard for apple butter. Apple butter is considered to be pure as long as it doesn't contain 4 or more rodent hairs per 100 grams, or 5 or more whole insects, not counting gnats or aphids, because, of course, those are good to eat. Who doesn't like a good gnat or aphid? How about mushrooms? When you get 15 grams of mushrooms, which I love mushrooms, they're considered to be pure and okay unless there's an average of 20 or more maggots of any size with them. Coffee beans. For all of you who I know love coffee, and you already had some that we probably served you right at the campus this morning. Coffee beans only get withdrawn from the market if there's an average of 10% more of them that are insect infested. Now about hot dogs. You want to hear about hot dogs? I'll just say this about hot dogs. If we took all the impurities out of hot dogs, there wouldn't be much left in the hot dog. The truth is, all things being considered equal, we human beings, we love purity. If we can have purity, we want purity. But we know purity is tough, so we're prepared to accept a lower standard. And that's not just true when it comes to coffee beans or hot dogs or apple butter. It's true in more important areas. It's true about our hearts. It's true about our lives. It's true about our world, about our relationships. And the truth is that when you and I look at our lives, at our own little lives, we tend to look at our own impurities and we go, that's not that big a deal. But then when you put all of us together with all of our impurities, what you wind up with is you wind up with the world in which you and I live. Well, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, we're talking about this man Moses, and actually we're learning from Moses in his pursuit of following God. And particularly these days, we're learning about the people that he is trying to lead, which if you've watched the video just before, and that didn't catch you up, I'll just tell you, it's the people of Israel. Moses is leading the people of God, the Israelites. He's leading them out of slavery in Egypt, and he's leading them to the Promised Land. And in the Promised Land, they're going to represent what it means to have a relationship with God to the rest of the world. And we've been watching the last few weeks as this wandering ragtag little group of former slaves wanders in the desert, and mostly they just whine and complain. They're ready to turn back at any sign of trouble. They're ready to go back to slavery in Egypt. But you need to remember, God has a plan for the whole world, and that plan involves, it comes directly through them. God intends to deliver the whole world, and it starts with this little group of impure people. How can he possibly get them prepared? What can he possibly do to get them on track? God has a plan, and it involves giving them his law, the 10 Commandments, which are representative of that. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about the 10 Commandments, and if you're one of those people that you love it when you come and we show you lots of verses, boy, today is your day, because I'm going to show you lots of verses, and we're going to talk about the law that God gives to the human race through the people of Israel. But before I get to that, I want to talk to you about what God says to them before they get the law. I want to show you how he gets to giving them the law. This is in the book of Exodus, which is the second book in the Bible, and primarily this book is about the life of Moses and about his leadership. But here's how God addresses his people before he gives the law. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you're to say to the house of Jacob and what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourself have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you'll obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, did you notice when I was reading that the mention of the law, before there's any mention of the law, that God has already said to them, you're my nation? He says to them, he already talks about what he's done. He says, I carried you on eagle's wings, he says. And he describes for them his vision for them as a nation before they've ever heard the law. He says to them, you're going to be three things. He says, you're my treasured possession. Out of all the people on the earth, God just chose this group of people, this little group of slaves, and they are his treasured possession. Then he says, you'll be a kingdom of priests. Every person can relate directly to me. You have direct access to me, God says, just like a priest. And then finally he says in verse 6, you'll be a holy nation. You're the model community that's set apart specifically for representing what a relationship with God looks like on this planet. And then notice, I want to read to you the extent of the preparations he tells them to make to come and to meet him. Verse 10. And then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready for the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not go up to the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. They shall surely be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid upon them. Whether people or animals, they shall not be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain. What God is trying to do with this is God is trying to establish a new category in the minds of people. And frankly, it's a category that we don't have all that well either. The category is holy. And let me show you again how he goes about this in verse 23. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourselves warned us. Put limits around the mountain, set it apart as holy. Now, if you've ever wondered, what does holy mean? Well, that's what it means. It means set apart. It means put for a special purpose, set apart and designated for a purpose. I'll give you an example of how it could be used in our day and sometimes is. Imagine that you come home and you're the first one home, and you walk in the house, and when you walk in the house, like in our house, you walk in, you come out of the garage, and you're immediately in the kitchen. And you notice on the counter in the kitchen, there's a cake, a homemade cake, and not just any homemade cake. This cake is a brown sugar cake that has been topped with homemade caramel icing, which for me is one of the great proofs of the existence of God. And this cake has sitting next to it a note, a Post-it note, and on the Post-it note, which has been written for you, it just says one word, no. And what the writer of the note is trying to say is, this cake is not for you. This cake has been set apart. Apparently this cake that was made in the house that you live in, made by money that you probably made with stuff that you probably purchased. This cake was not made for you, but the person who made it for somebody that they apparently love a lot more than you. And what they're saying to you with this note that says no is, you can't eat from this cake. It's been set apart. It's holy. And the message of the note is clear. The message is, of all other food in the house you may freely eat, but when you eat of this cake, the brown sugar cake with the caramel icing, when you eat of that cake, you shall surely die. This cake is holy. It's set apart. And that's all the root meaning of the word holy means. It means to be set apart. It means to designate it. That's why in the Bible, lots of stuff gets called holy. Clothing gets called holy. Water gets called holy. There's food that's called holy. Now, nothing in the object itself makes it holy. Only God in himself is holy. And only God can make something holy when it's set apart for his use. God has set apart this nation. He set them apart to be holy for his purpose. Now, this set apartness, this holy thing, it was fairly common in Israel's day when it came to religions. However, there's something pretty unique about this holy God. It's it's his character. This God is vastly different than the set-apartness of this God is different than other gods of those around them. They understood that above all else, what made this God set apart was his purity, his character, his love and grace toward his people. They understood that above everything else, God's set-apartness was that he, not unlike other gods, treated them with love and grace. God was set apart from sin. And the problem with a God who is set apart from sin for them is the same for you and me. We are not set apart from sin. And you and I, while we stand in the presence of a holy God, have the same problem they had at the foot of the mountain. We're attracted to his holiness. We long for it. We want it. But there's something in us that says, it'll destroy me if I get too close. We're attracted to holiness. We know that we need it. We know that we need to be set apart. But we're afraid that it might destroy us, that it might ruin us. Now, what I'm about to read to you is an attempt by the writer of the book of Exodus to describe the indescribable. What it looks like for sinful human beings like you and I to stand and meet a holy, set-apart God. And this trip to meet a holy God, this is a trip that every human being will take. You and I both will take it. This writer is trying to describe to us what it's like. So what I want to do today is I want to ask you to work real hard in just the next few moments to imagine what this really was like. I want you to hear these words, and I want you to do your best to imagine what it would mean to come into the presence of a holy God. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. A trumpet blast was associated with them with a call to worship. It's when they were to know that God was ready to meet with them, that God had come to the mountain. A trumpet blast signaled for them, come to worship. But today there's a trumpet blast, but no trumpet player. And everybody immediately knows and trembles. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Imagine what it would be like to stand there and smoke and an unseen trumpet playing louder even than the thunder and lightning and smoke. What would be your reaction when Moses speaks and then voice of God comes and it sounds like that? Well, here's their response. When the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Now, because I know how most of you hear that you think that's an abnormal reaction, that God, because he is so loving, so kind, that's not the way human beings are when they approach God. But you need to know that's the normal reaction people have when they meet a holy God. Person after person after person in the Bible, when they actually encounter the living, holy, set apart from sin God, they tremble and they're afraid. But we live in a very casual society, and that is not our reaction. Our thoughts of God are very different. And very seldom do we tremble, do we stand in awe. But on this mountain, God speaks. And God gives the law, the 10 Commandments, what would become the ethical standards that would set the pace for human society for the next several thousand years, even down to our day. And here's what I want to ask you to do. And I know this is different than what we would normally do, so if you're visiting with us, we don't normally do this. But out of reverence for what the law of God has done for our society today, in just a moment, I'm going to read the 10 Commandments. And out of reverence for God, I'm going to ask that you stand like people stood at the foot of that mountain. I'm going to read each of the commands, I'll make a comment, and we'll hear from God. So would you stand right now, right wherever you are, and I'll read. Commandment number 1. You shall have no other God before me. God says, you should serve me, worship me, only me. Make worship of me your number 1 priority in life. Commandment number 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Serve God, only God. Not a representative of God. Serve God and Him only. Commandment number 3. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, we tend to think of that mainly as profanity and words that we might say along with the name of God, and that certainly is covered there. But let me be clear. Jesus makes clear that this also involves using spiritual language to cover up the darkness of our heart by taking God's name to cover up our own darkness. Commandment number 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor God every week by ceasing from your striving and remembering that it's God Himself that provides, not you with your work in your hands. God Himself provides. So set aside time to worship Him and to remember Him, at least every 7 days. Commandment number 5, honor your father and mother. Even when it's difficult, honor them. Commandment number 6, you shall not murder. And this, of course, goes beyond killing. It's very clear in the New Testament this involves not holding grudges and working hard to forgive people that have hurt you. Commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery. And this includes things like not giving into lust. It includes being sexually pure. Commandment number 8, you shall not steal. God wants us to be givers, not takers. Commandment number 9, you shall not bear false witness. We're to be people of integrity. We should speak the truth. Just the truth should flow. Commandment number 10, you shall not covet. We're to refuse to give in to envy. We're to love people and not things. The law of God for the people of God. Okay, you can be seated. When Israel is given the law of God, they hold it like this treasure, this prized possession. They took it as the truth of God given to them, their prized possession as His set-apart people. And I could spend a long time talking to you about the 10 Commandments, and it would be helpful and probably very good. But I know that many of you have other questions, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the questions that get raised continually every time someone reads the Old Testament, particularly people in our community who for the first time we've asked you to read the book of Exodus, or you're reading through the Old Testament, and for the first time you have these thoughts about the Old Testament law and the 10 Commandments. I want to spend the time that I have left answering those questions. Here's the first one. Sometimes somebody will start reading the Old Testament and they'll say something like this to me. They'll say, Ed, I am so thankful for Jesus and for grace because I don't like the God of the Old Testament very much. I mean, there's so many laws that people had to keep. Did people really have to keep all of those to make God like them? So let me be real clear on this. The law, including the 10 Commandments, was never given so that you could earn God's favor and somehow appease Him. That was never their intent. They were given to Israel as an act of grace. God comes to them and makes them His people as an act of grace. And what He's doing with the law, the 10 Commandments, is He's describing to them what His family, what people who live in His grace, what they look like. In fact, I'll just remind you again of the very first statement God makes when He's introducing this. This is Exodus 20, verse 2. It's the beginning of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God. Now, that's a statement of covenant. That's what it means. Now, we don't talk a lot about covenants, and we don't hear a lot about them because they're not really mean very much in our day. But to their ears, they would get that he's talking about covenant. And because of a lot of archaeological work, we know a lot about the same things they knew about covenants. In fact, all covenants had the same general elements. And what I want you to see is that all of them are included in these things that God does in the law. First, there would be a preamble to the covenant, which we're it would identify the powerful king that's making the covenant and the people that he's making it with, the people who will be his subjects. Then there would be a historical review where they would talk about the great gracious things that the king had done for these people so that they would want to be a part of the covenant. Then there would be statements about the expected behavior on both people's parts in the keeping of the covenant. Then they would say where the copies of the covenant would be kept, how often it ought to be read out loud so that people could keep it. And then finally, there would be a vow of faithfulness on the part of the people to say, we will be covenant keepers. We will keep the covenant. Now, here's why I wanted to say that to you quickly, because I know some of you aren't all that interested, but here's why I want you to know that. In the book of Exodus, and really throughout the rest of the Old Testament particularly, you see all these elements of a covenant being given to us again and again and again. It's that the law, all this law we read in the Old Testament, is really about being a part of this covenant. There's the preamble. I already read it to you. Exodus 20, verse 2, God says, I am the Lord your God. And the key word there is your God. Before I've ever given you the law, I didn't give you the law so that you could earn your way to be my people. I'm your God before you ever did anything to deserve it. And then there's the historical review that flows right out of that. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. I did this for you before you ever did anything with the covenant. And it's then, and only then, after he reminds them of the preamble and then of the historical review, that he talks to them about the commandments, about how they're going to relate to each other. But you just need to be clear, these were never rules that were given to anybody that somebody could say, oh, I kept all the rules of the covenant, therefore God is my God. They were intended to describe what a relationship with a holy, set-apart God looked like. What it would be, what it would look like to be holy and set apart yourself. And really, that's the nature of any covenant. A covenant is a binding commitment, but the covenant is the foundational part, not the way the two parties act. In fact, one of the covenants that you hear about a lot in our day is the marriage covenant. And the marriage covenant is the same way. I always say to people, marriage covenants are really one-sided. We say to each other in the marriage covenant, I take you, better or worse, it's totally on me, no matter what, better or worse, whatever you do, you give me better or worse, I'm with you. Richer or poorer, either one, I'm with you. Sickness or health, I'm with you. I've made a covenant. Now, imagine 34, a little over years ago, I had come to Becky when we were just dating, and I had said to her, Becky, if you will come and you'll be nice to me, and you'll clean my clothes and clean my house and make my food, and you'll prepare snacks for me before I watch baseball games, then I would agree to be your husband. How do you think that would have gone? Well, some of you that know my wife know it would not have gone very well. But then, of course, after we're married, after I have agreed to the covenant, we've agreed to love each other, those kind of behaviors, they just flow sort of naturally out of her toward me. Okay, that's a bad example. God's covenant is always a grace deal. And it's always been true. God has always offered grace to his people. It was true in the New Testament. It was true in the Old Testament. People have always only entered relationship with this set-apart, holy God by grace. There is no other way. It cannot be earned. But people will read this law and they'll wonder to themselves, how did people get saved through keeping the law? Well, they didn't. In fact, even in their day, there would be people that would think, I can just keep the law, I can offer the sacrifices, I can go to the temple at the right time, I can outwardly do all of the right things, and even though my heart is far from the covenant, even though I'm not really true and loyal to God, I just outwardly do the right things, then when I die, God owes me what the covenant says he owes me. I'm in. And God, quite regularly throughout the Old Testament, is quite angered by that kind of behavior from people. In fact, let me just read one of these. A lot of these statements can be found in the prophets. I'll read one of them to you from the book of Isaiah. This is Isaiah chapter 1. This is God speaking. He says, the multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to be? In other words, these things you're doing that the law says to do, what do I care about that? I I have more than enough burnt offerings. Stop bringing me your meaningless offerings. Your incense, which was a part again of the law, it's detestable to me. Instead, stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Just to be clear, God says those things at the end, that's the heart that flows out of a relationship with me. And that kind of thinking that people have, that I can somehow outwardly do what God wants me to do, this outward keeping of some law, and somehow God owes me something, that did not end in the Old Testament. Now, people often won't say it, but you can tell by the way they live, the way they come and interact with us, and the way they talk about questions they have about God, that people are in effect saying, I know that I'm not living up to God's will. I know I don't keep His covenant with regard to how I live sexually. I know I don't keep His covenant with how I do with worship. I know that in many, many ways I am totally, openly disobedient to God. But when I die, because I said a prayer, because I was baptized, because I used to go to church, God owes me heaven. Let's be clear. That is not the God of the Bible. God has always only been interested in the heart of the people involved in the covenant with Him. God says, do right. Stop doing wrong. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. The issue God has always been concerned with is the heart that flows out of the covenant, not the outward keeping of the law only. Which leads to another question people will have, well, if God then is only concerned about the heart, if it's always been that and not the law, then why is there so much detail in the law? I mean, you read it and it's like Moses is obsessive compulsive or something. It's chapter after chapter of details about the law. And you may have noticed, I read to you the Ten Commandments, and there are these few broad laws, but there are a lot of really detailed laws, if you've been reading through, about very specific situations, like stuff about what food you can eat, what you can't eat. And I'll show you one, Leviticus 11:29. It says, these are animals that are unclean for you. In other words, you couldn't eat them. The weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Well, that's a lot of detail, and to be honest, it seems pretty wasted because I don't think most of y'all wanted to eat the skink or the chameleon anyway. And it's not just that. There are regulations about how you do your work with regard to farming. He says in Deuteronomy 24:20, when you beat the olives from your trees, in other words, when you're going through and you're harvesting, don't go over the trees a second time. And you look at that and people go, man, there's law after law after law of this kind of stuff. Why is it so specific? God really just cares about the heart. Well, you have to keep in mind where human culture is at the time. You know, I know that every generation thinks that they're worse than the previous generation. In fact, I have people write me or send me books and say, you know, we're in the last days because times are getting so evil and we're way worse than we've ever been. And I just want to go, man, read a history book. There is no way we are worse than we've ever been. It is hard for us in our day to talk about how calming and how civilizing Christian culture has been on the world, even for people who don't believe it. And that's not just me saying it, but 2,000 years of Christian culture, even historians who don't believe in what Christianity teaches talk about the ethics of Christian ethics and how they've affected our world. Before Christianity, before the rule of God that came through the Judeo-Christian ethic became popular in our world, child sacrifice was fairly common. Slaves were owned worldwide, and still today, where Christianity is not widely held, slaves are owned and sold as property. People are treated as if they are nothing more than a piece of property. Women in regions then and still today, children and women are in danger because they're seen to be as nothing. That's the culture that this law is given in. So part of what God is doing is He's starting where human beings are. There's a developmental quality to what God is doing in the law. Something else that you should know about the law, and you can see this when you read it. There are examples given to us in the law of how to keep it, but they aren't intended to be exhaustive for us. For instance, I already read to you the passage in Deuteronomy where it talks about harvesting from olive trees, and you're not supposed to go over them a second time. Instead, you're to leave them so that the poor and the fatherless, the orphans, the widows can come through, and they can take some of them. What God is saying is not, I want you to be sloppy farmers and leave part of your harvest behind. It's not about that. He's saying to them, I want you to make a place in your economy that is not just about you and how much you can make. You need to make a place in your life for care for the poor. And it wasn't just about olive trees. It wasn't like they could look and say, hey, it's just olive trees. God doesn't mention the fig tree. God was making a paradigm. He was choosing an example. And the judges in Israel, they got this. If somebody came in and said, well, I took all the figs off my tree, they'd go, no, God says that you're to leave part of them for those who are from another country, for the fatherless, for the widows. You're to make a place for the poor in your life. God has it's always had a developmental quality to the law, and it's always been about your heart, about getting the example of your heart. The point is, the law was never, ever, ever to be this kind of narrow, nitpicking, legalistic, rule-keeping mentality that so many people who follow God fall into. It was never about that. There are these few real broad laws, and there are lots of examples, specific examples, but they were never about just obey this and nothing else matters. Because the great promise of the Old Testament comes eventually through prophets. The prophet Jeremiah says, through the prophet, God says, the day is coming when I will write these laws in my people's minds and on the people's hearts. So the final, most important, and most personal question I have for you today is, so how are you doing with this set apartness that God calls you to? How are you doing with your own holiness, with purity? You know, in Exodus chapter 24, when Moses has read the whole covenant to them, the whole book of the covenant, at the end of it, the people make this vow of faithfulness to the covenant. In Exodus 24:7, the people say, we will do everything that the Lord says, we will obey. And of course they struggled. The whole Old Testament is about their struggle to live up to that vow. And the promise of the prophets is that the day is coming when one day it'll be written on the hearts of the people. And of course the New Testament tells us that that day came when Jesus was resurrected and the Holy Spirit descended on his followers. And the law, the Spirit, lived in us. And the thought was that when the law came into our hearts, then there would be human beings that would walk around and they would no more think about breaking the law of God than they would think about breaking the law of gravity. Not because they were people who were better than anybody else and they were nitpicking law keepers, but because they, of course, had become the right kind of hearted people. They were people with hearts full of love. Do you understand that all of this law, all of this Moses bringing the law, it was a developmental process, and it's come for you? It was so you and I could have the law of God, the intent of God, written in our hearts so we could be the kind of people that God would want us to be. Not so you and I could walk around and we could think we were more righteous than somebody else because we kept the law, not because we could be nitpicking rule pointer outers to everybody out, not so we could think that we're better than anybody, but so that we could live the way that Jesus lived and feel what Jesus felt and love what he loved and speak truth and do justice and show compassion and give generously, not because the law requires us to do it, but because that's the way you would want to live. Who wouldn't want to live that way? And the question is, how are you doing with that? I want to direct your attention now, as we said we would earlier in the service, back to the next steps cards on your connection card. We say every week, and we really believe it. It's not just something we say, that nobody came here haphazardly. That you're here on purpose, that God intends for every one of us to take a next step in our relationship with him, and you being here, joining in this, is a part of that happening. And so we feel it's our responsibility to help you concretely take next steps and pray for you and help you in that way. And so every week we suggest some, and maybe God's been speaking to you, and some of the suggestions we have here will help you in your decision to personally follow God. Maybe today you've decided that today is the day that you set yourself apart and you begin a relationship with God. Or maybe this is all very new for you, and your decision is that you're just going to come and learn again. What we're asking is that you would listen to God, and maybe you have a whole other step that you would just write in these blanks at the bottom, and we could pray with that for you as you take a next step in the way that God leads you to be the person He's calling you to be, set apart for Him. Whatever decision you make, we ask you just to fill that out. You can even fold it over, and you can drop it in the offering when it comes by in a moment. If you're with us for the first time at any of our campuses, this is really the only thing you need to feel like you put it in the offering. The offering's for those who consider community Christian. They'll be their church home. It's a part of our worship. We're so glad you came, and we hope this service has been our gift to you. But what I want to do in closing is I want to ask you to imagine with me for a moment. What would it be like for you to live with God's Word written on your heart? And for one day, there's no envy in you. There's no desire for you to get back at somebody or to have something that somebody else has. There's no lust. There's no desire for anything but what God has for you, what His best would be for you. What would that look like in your life? Imagine if all of us, just for one day, if we lived that way, what would our world be like? What would it be like for one day where no one was killed, where there are no drive-by shootings, where there's no terrorism, where there are no children abused, where in every home the hearts of the parents are turned to the children and the children turn to their parents, where every marriage is built on a covenant of love toward one another, where everybody's giving themselves to each other? What would it be like to live like that for one day? Well, the place that begins is with us. What if you lived the kind of life that Jesus lived if He were in your place, in your home, at your work, in your school, in your relationships? What would that look like? If you would, I'd like to pray for you now. Would you bow your heads? And while your head is bowed, would you talk to God about that? If you can do it with integrity, would you say what that group of people said? We will do everything, I will do everything, God, that you show me to do. If there's anything that's getting in the way of that, would you confess that to God right now? Would you maybe make your next step removing that and allow us to pray with you about that? God, right now, we are so thankful for you, that by an act of grace you've chosen to know us as your people, and that you sent Jesus to show us who you're like so that we could know you and come into relationship with you. We thank you for His love, for knowing us, and God, Father, I pray that you would help us take the next steps of living the life you've called us to. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for His love for us. In His name I pray. Amen.